Rob, welcome to the podcast.
Pleasure to be with you, Jay.
Of course. So, for those that don't know you, you're an expert on pre-birth planning. You've written several books on this. I'm actually reading one of them right now. Well, it's not going to show up in the video, but it's Your Soul's Plan, which I think was your first book, right?
That is the first book, right?
Okay. Yeah, it's really good. I wanted to have it done by the time we did this, but I'm just going through it, reading and rereading and taking my time with it. I found it very enlightening. I really enjoy the topic of pre-birth planning. I think the first person I heard on it who I actually took seriously was Christian Sundberg. You ever heard of him?
I do know who he is, yeah.
Okay, yeah. He seems like a really good guy, and he's got a great story about how he had a pre-birth planning experience spontaneously after I guess he experienced some trauma. And he walks everybody through the how you come into the incarnation, how you're sort of veiled and you forget when you get here, and there's a benefit for that spiritually and all this cool stuff. But I'm curious how I imagine when you were a kid, you didn't think I want to be an expert on pre-birth planning. Let me map out that career path. How did you get into this?
Yeah, I would never in a million years have anticipated this, given where I came from. What happened for me is that I was self-employed as a marketing and communications consultant for a number of years, basically doing different kinds of corporate writing. And I did not enjoy this at all. And more to the point, I felt that I was not doing what I had come to Earth to do, even though I didn't know what that was. And all of this came to a head, really to an existential crisis in the year 2003. I knew that I couldn't continue doing the corporate work, but I had no idea what to do. And I tried various conventional routes to figure this out. I took the Myers-Briggs inventory and had career counseling. That was interesting, but it didn't tell me what to do. And I went to friends and family and asked all of them, and they didn't have any great insights. And I was getting nowhere. And finally, I thought, I really need to do something out of the box here. What can I do? An idea came to me, go see a psychic medium. Now, mediumship is not part of my background. And at that time, I wasn't even sure if I believed in it, but nothing else was working. So I thought, well, why not? I'll give it a try. So I did this on May 7 of 2003. And the reason I remember that date is that that was the day on which my life changed. The medium started the session by saying, your spirit guides are here. And I said, what is a spirit guide? And that gives you an idea of where I was at that time. So she explained that. And then she said, your guides would like to talk directly with you. She started to channel them. And they said, you planned your life, including your biggest challenges, before you were born. And I said, well, why in the world would I have done something like that? And then they launched into this long explanation of why I had planned each of my challenges. And what was really compelling here was that they knew what the challenges had been, even though I hadn't told the medium anything, and I didn't tell them anything as I was talking to them. So they knew literally everything about me without me saying a single word. Well, this blew my mind wide open. And in the days and weeks after that session, I thought about this idea that we plan our lives and our challenges, thought about it constantly. And what it did for me was that it really created quite a deep healing, because it allowed me for the first time in my life to see deeper meaning to the challenges that had taken place. And then I thought, well, if it can create a healing for me, surely it can do that for others. That was when I first started to think about writing a book on the subject. And then two other very important things happened, all within just a few weeks of the session with the medium. I was introduced to a woman who has the ability to go into trance and channel her soul. So I had the extraordinary opportunity to spend about 15 hours talking with her soul about pre-birth planning. And that information served as the foundation for the books I went on to write. And then really the most significant thing of all, I was home in my apartment in Chicago where I lived at the time. It was a weekday afternoon, typical work day. And I decided to take a break and go for a walk. So I'm walking down the sidewalk, middle of the afternoon in Chicago. And all of a sudden, every time I looked at another person, this feeling of pure, overwhelming, unconditional love for that person washed over me. It was a divine love, a transcendent love. Those are the words that get closest to this. It was not a human kind of love. It was not conditional in any way, nor was it personal in any way. And I felt this for every person I saw. It only lasted about an hour, but it changed everything. It changed my understanding of who and what I am, who and what each one of us are. And you could say that I was caused to know in this experience, I was caused to know that we as souls are made from the energy of unconditional love. I got that message loud and clear. What I didn't know was why this was happening at that time. That became clear a couple of years later. By that time, I had looked at a lot of pre-birth plans for the first book, Your Soul's Plan. And what I had found in every case, no exceptions, every pre-birth plan was based on complete unconditional love for every person involved. That was true even when great challenges were being planned. It was true when quote unquote negative roles were being scripted for people. It was always based on unconditional love. And then I realized, aha, that experience walking down the sidewalk a couple of years ago, that was gifted to me so that when I found this result in my research, I would know that what I was finding was truth. So the combination of these three things, the session with the medium, the woman's channeling of her higher self, and this experience of unconditional love for all people, the combination got me to say, okay, I'll leave the corporate world. I'll attempt to write a book about how we plan our lives before we're born. And then 3 years later, Your Soul's Plan came out. It's given me a completely different and much more fulfilling life in which I know that I'm doing what I came here to do. And it's making a difference in the world. And that's why I wanted to do this.
Did you quit your job immediately or did you just put the plan in place? Because I think a lot of people are probably in a similar situation where they feel like what they're doing is not what they're here to do, and they have a gift or something and they want to do more of that. Do you have any advice for those types of people?
I did quit immediately because I just felt this overwhelming, burning desire in my heart to do this. Really, a need to do it. I would say if your desire to do whatever it is that strong, that much of a burning desire, then go ahead and take whatever steps you need in order to do it. But here's the key. This is what I learned along the way. The universe always supports a courageous decision. But there's a trick to it, and that is you have to keep making one courageous decision after another, after another. So this is where a lot of people trip themselves up because they'll make one courageous decision. Let's say they leave their job to pursue their dream. And then they think, all right, now the universe is going to support my decision. But then they start making a series of fear-based decisions. Then things don't work out the way they had hoped, and they feel betrayed by the universe. Well, the universe would have supported them if only they had continued to make courageous decisions.
So they have to follow through, basically.
They have to follow through.
That's really good advice. I like that. So I'm going to go straight into a deep question, and you might not have, an answer, maybe a general answer, but why do we choose to come here at all?
Basically, to know who and what we are. So I spoke a moment ago about how I was shown that we're made from the energy of unconditional love. The non-physical realm we come from, as I understand it, is a realm of unconditional love. So if you think about this, if we're made from the energy of unconditional love, and we're in this realm of unconditional love, we don't experience any contrast to ourselves, which in turn means we don't fully understand or appreciate who or what we are. So I think we come to Earth for the contrast, what you could call the not love, which we would all agree there's a lot of, because through the experience of the not love, by the time you go home at the end of a lifetime, you understand much more deeply what unconditional love really and truly is, which is another way of saying you now have a much more profound self-knowing.
Now, do we choose every single scenario, or is it more of like a general game plan? And then maybe there are certain milestones, energetic milestones, or catalyst moments that we have pre-programmed. Do you even know anything about that, or is it even possible to know that?
I do know something about that. Here's the best analogy I can give you. My wife is a channel. She channels a group consciousness, a collective that we affectionately call the beings of light, or BOL for short. So the BOL gave us this analogy to answer that question. They said, imagine that a single sheet of paper is a complete set of pre-birth plans. So if that's the case, then every individual has their own stack of sheets of paper. That's how many sets of pre-birth plans every person has. Now, within that stack, each sheet, each set of plans varies by vibration or frequency. The sheets at the top of the stack are the highest vibrational pre-birth plans. That's where most of the learning is done through love, peace, and joy, not so much through pain and suffering. Sheets at the bottom of the stack are the opposite of that. Most of the learning is through pain and suffering, not so much through love, peace, and joy. So everybody's got their own stack that's like that. And you control where you are, which sheet you're on, by your vibration in each moment. So essentially, if you want to move up the stack, which everybody does, the thing to do is to be the most loving person you can possibly be. And so what I tell people is to make it simple. Whatever you have to make a decision, no matter what it is, how big or small it is, ask yourself the following question. What would love with a capital L do now? Whatever the answer is, do that. If you do that consistently over a long period of time, you move up and up and up in that stack, and you go from a lot of pain and suffering to learning through love, peace, and joy.
Yeah, well, I think what you said right there was actually the secret almost to everything, which is choosing love in every decision. So how is this loving for others? How is this loving to
Right.
the universe? And how is this loving to myself? I think I remember hearing you talking about the concept of surrender and the importance of that. Uh, can you go into that a little bit? Or is that too?
I'd be happy to talk about that. Surrender is very, very important. I would go so far as to say it's my primary spiritual path at this time. So surrender means acceptance, and it means allowing. And in order to do that, you really need to have a lot of faith and trust in the benevolence of the universe. The reason that surrender is so helpful and so important is that when something quote unquote bad or unpleasant happens, the natural human response is to go into resistance to it. Now, when you do that, you will probably think that you are resisting just this one person or thing that you don't like. But that isn't the message you're sending to the universe. The universe doesn't get that your intention is to resist just this one thing. What it hears energetically is a big, loud no coming from you. And it takes it as a global no. It takes it as a no to physical health. It takes it as a no to abundance. It takes it as a no to love, a no to spiritual clarity, a no to every blessing that you actually want in your life. So you've probably heard the expression, when it rains, it pours. That expression describes this phenomenon. Something mildly bad happens, that's the rain. Then somebody goes into resistance to that. They give the universe this global no, which shuts down the flow of all blessings into their life. And then everything starts to go wrong. That's when it starts to pour. That's why we have that expression.
Yeah, I agree. I think it might not be just your primary path. I think it's something that everybody is going to have to learn. And I think that if you unpack the concept of resistance, which is sort of you have pain and then you have suffering. Pain is, everyone experiences pain, but then suffering is sort of optional because through resistance.
Right.
But if you unpack resistance, and this is just my theory, it sort of comes from judgment because and then that sort of comes from this idea of contrast. So we look around at the world and something happens and we label it as good or we label it as bad. And then that creates this judgment creates this contrast in a desired end state or in a place that we want to avoid. And then that sort of leads to us resisting one path over another path. which then creates the suffering. So it's,
Exactly.
yeah. I think about this stuff all the time because I am an expert at resisting life. And I think we all have been at some point.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm curious, do we have to graduate this earth plane? Do we just keep coming back? Do we have a choice in the matter?
My understanding is you do have a choice, and nobody is forced to come back or forced to come back and experience anything they don't really want to experience. But when you're back on the other side, your viewpoint is very different than it is here. So you always hear people saying, "Oh, I would never plan this and I would never choose to come back. It's so hard to be here." That's the viewpoint of the incarnate personality. When you're back on the other side, your viewpoint is very different in certain specific ways. One is you know that an incarnation is actually very brief. Another is that you know that nobody is permanently harmed by anything that happens here. And another is that you know that the wisdom, the healing, the growth, the learning that will come out of the incarnation will become part of you literally for all eternity. You might or might not know these things when you're in body, but you're acutely aware of all three of them from the other side. So from that perspective, the lifetime is very brief. No one is permanently harmed, yet the wisdom is yours for eternity. From that perspective, it makes it a lot more likely that you will choose to come back.
Yeah, when you have the 1,000-foot view and you can actually see that, oh, I'm not just suffering for no reason. I'm suffering because I have a history in other lives of, greed or this or that or whatever it is, and I'm working through that, or I'm healing something through this quote unquote negative experience. When you look at it like that, and you mentioned that the concept of pre-birth planning brought you a lot of uh, closure in your seeking. It's done the same thing for me because when I look at things completely differently now. I don't think, oh, it's just something bad, what is bad, but it's not just something bad, it's potentially an opportunity for growth, or it's you're healing something, or you're healing something for the collective of humanity. I mean, it probably gets even bigger like that too. um do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, the viewpoint you just described is one of my primary intentions in doing the work that I do. So the first thing that an awareness of pre-birth planning will do for someone, if they accept it, is that it will pull them out of victim consciousness. Obviously, if you plan something, then you are not truly a victim. The next step beyond that is what you just described. And that step really involves diving into the why something was planned. What are the underlying lessons you wanted to learn before you came into body? And a lot of what I talk about in the books are these underlying lessons. That's the focus of the workshops and the private sessions I do as a hypnotist. We're getting at what are the underlying lessons, the reasons why you plan things. That's vitally important because once you know that, then you can learn those lessons in a much more conscious and much less painful manner.
What I liked about your soul's plan as I'm going through it is you have picked, I think, 10 individuals or something, and you're going through each of these individuals who have had some kind of traumatic event in their past, or some kind of suffering. And then you're breaking it down as to, why would someone have an illness, for example? Why would someone have a relationship problem? So there's actually a tangible benefit that someone can get from having a specific type of adversity in life. Um, could you talk about, for example, the people with an illness, why someone might want to choose to have an illness in life, even though it can be extremely suffering and debilitating?
Well, the physical illness chapter is the first chapter of the first book, Your Soul's Plan. So let's talk about the person who's the subject of that chapter. It's a gentleman whose name is John Elmore. And John plans prior to birth to contract the AIDS virus as a homosexual man. Now, somebody will say, well, why in the world would anyone want to have that experience? Well, in his pre-birth planning, he's asked to choose a mission, just as we all are. And so he's shown scenes of what Earth will be like at this time period in which he's going to incarnate. And after looking at a number of these scenes, the conclusion he comes to is that judgment is a big issue for humanity. And he would like his mission to be something that helps in regard to judgment. So the idea that he comes up with in conversation with another member of his soul group is that this other soul will give him the AIDS virus. And then, as somebody who has that, as he goes through his years, everybody who meets him, who encounters him, and who knows that he has AIDS, then has an opportunity to put judgment aside and feel compassion in their heart. That's essentially what he chose as his mission. And the AIDS virus was the means to address this issue of judgment. There could be many, many other reasons for planning an illness, but that was his.
So what you're saying is that by encountering a type of contrast that you may have had a trouble with in the past, or maybe collectively humanity has had an issue with, and then making a decision to go one way or the other can sort of heal humanity. So if we have an issue with judgment, like you were saying, by experiencing things that make you want to judge them, but then choosing love instead heals you and heals them, the karmic balance, and then it also heals the collective as well. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And that's why in the channeling session with an angel in that first chapter, I say to the angel, so do I understand correctly then that AIDS is actually healing humanity? And the response is yes, for the reasons that you just mentioned.
So that kind of puts things in perspective when you look at the social issues that are happening nowadays and political and war and all the chaos, basically. As bad as it is, there's probably an opportunity in there for us to heal certain things. Have you analyzed that at all?
I think that's true in any time period and in any incarnation, but there's something additional and quite big going on in this particular lifetime for people. And that is, as I understand it, this is an Ascension lifetime. So probably much of your audience already knows about Ascension, but just as a basic primer, what's happening, as I understand it, is that the Earth is ascending or literally moving up in vibration. And we've already moved from third density, or what some call the third dimension, into fourth density. We're headed to fifth, which is a vibration of oneness consciousness and unconditional love. That means we're going home while staying in a physical body. So this is a remarkable opportunity. Now, ascension is caused by a lot of divine light from source flooding the planet. The light has the effect of bringing it to the surface, bringing to conscious awareness everything of a lower vibration, everything that's unlike the light. It does this as the term that's used is purification. Purification has to happen because these lower vibrational energies can't go with us in the fifth density. So we have to clear or purify them. This is happening collectively to the whole human race, which is why you see more craziness than ever in the news. And it's happening individually in each person's life, whether or not you're consciously aware of it. So basically, what's involved in clearing or purification is your stuff, so to speak, comes to your conscious awareness. And then you need to recognize it. Don't go into denial about it. Recognize it. Thank it sincerely, if you can, for whatever it has taught you. Bless it. And then set an intention just to give it over to the universe. That's essentially all you have to do to purify or clear these lower vibrational energies. But people fall into the trap. They'll see something come up in their consciousness that they don't like, they're not proud of, that maybe they feel shame or guilt about. And so there's a tendency to suppress it or to go into resistance to it. And we just talked about that. Suppression or resistance is not going to allow anything to clear. And it's just going to come back around, probably in increasingly intense form later down the road.
The ascension concept is that something that started in like 2012? Is that kind of the analysis on when we crossed into this new era, new age?
It depends on your definition of ascension. I would say that it started in a much more mild form back in the 1960s, when you had that awakening of consciousness and the flower children, so to speak, flower power. I think that was the beginning of ascension, but it has ramped up considerably since then. 2012 was a huge energetic marker, and it's just gotten even more intense since that time.
Yeah, in the last maybe 4 or 5 years, I've noticed all kinds of stuff come up inside of me that I didn't even know was there, judgments or anger or unforgiveness, and that I've had to sit down and analyze and introspect on and think, hey, do I want to continue believing that or thinking that or feeling that? Is that kind of what's happening to everybody?
I think that is what's happening to everybody. Now, the reaction that you had to sit down and think about, do I want to be that way? That's an individual choice. A lot of people are making it, a lot of people are not. The ones who are not making that choice are the ones you see in the news who are lashing out and causing violence. That's the only way they know how to handle these things that are coming up inside them. And they recognize that anger or whatever it may be is out of alignment. And rather than acknowledge that they're out of alignment, because it's painful to do that, they project it onto somebody else, a person, a minority group, a different nationality, whatever it might be, because it's less painful to project. And that's what causes the violence in the world.
Well, you mentioned the victim mindset earlier, and if someone is locked in a victim mindset, there has to be a bad guy. There has to be something or someone that's external to you because you're not in a state of taking responsibility or ownership for whatever it is that you're experiencing. So, yeah, it makes perfect sense that if you're locked in the victim mindset and you're experiencing overwhelming emotion, negative emotions, that you're just going to pick a bad guy, the one that makes logical sense to you based on your belief systems and your upbringing and your paradigm, and then you're going to go attack that thing. And then that's sort of their purification process. It's sort of distorted in a way.
Yeah, I think that is very much what is playing out on the world stage. And so, if you're listening to this conversation and you start to recognize that perhaps you've done a bit of that in your own life, it's not something to go into shame over. It's not something to judge yourself over. This is a deeply ingrained human tendency. It's been this way for eons, and it's been perpetuated and encouraged through conditioning, I believe. But now we're moving beyond that, and our conditioning is starting to become evident to us. So if you see yourself projecting like that, don't go into shame or self-blame, just acknowledge it. And then again, thank it, if you can, sincerely for whatever it's taught you. Bless it, release it to the universe.
And when you say release it to the universe, is that like a visualization process, or do you just emotionally let go of this thing?
It's really an intention. If it helps you to visualize it, then I would encourage you to do that.
That's one of my favorite words, intention. I think a lot of people nowadays get the concept of intention very confused with thoughts and feelings and certain other things, whereas intention is sort of the mechanism of action of the soul. It wills itself to do something, which we call that intention. It's kind of difficult to put labels on it. Um, so back to the pre-birth planning. This might be out there for you, but probably not. Is it possible that we can incarnate other places into other types of life forms, like what we would call aliens?
Not only possible, it's my understanding that we do that, and all of us have done that, and all of us will do that again. The universe is infinite, and everything you can think of is out there somewhere, and lots of things you can't think of are out there somewhere. So there are many, many other physical planets on which you've had or will have incarnations, many different life forms. There are non-physical dimensions. There are planets and dimensions, as I understand it, that are all sound or color or emotion. Whatever you want to explore, it's out there somewhere.
It's an infinite universe. So you mentioned earlier that by uncovering what someone's pre-birth plan is, it can sort of help you heal from something. Uh, can you explain that and maybe talk about why that's the case?
Yeah, let's give an example. So in your soul's plan, there's a chapter about the pre-birth planning of deafness and blindness. The deafness story is about a young woman. She was 24 when I interviewed her for the book. Her name is Penelope. She was born completely deaf in both ears. So we wanted to understand, did she plan the experience of deafness? And if so, why would she do that? So one of the things I did in my research is that by working with mediums and channels, I was able to go into people's pre-birth planning sessions and hear the conversations that had taken place when they planned their lives. So Penelope and I did this. And when we went into her pre-birth planning session, we heard the conversation she had with her spirit guide when the deafness was chosen. And what emerges from that conversation, we find out that in the life immediately previous to this one, she had the same mother she has this time. But in that past life, when she was a little girl, she heard her mother shot to death by the mother's boyfriend. Now, she didn't witness the murder, but she heard the gunshots that led to her mother's death. Understandably, she was traumatized, so much so that it led to suicide later in that lifetime. So Penelope returned to spirit from that lifetime with what you could call an energy of unhealed trauma, which now needs to be healed. In the pre-birth planning session, her guide says to her, "My dear, would you prefer to be born deaf so that no similar trauma will happen to you again, and so that you can complete your healing from the last lifetime?" And she says, "Yes, that is what I want and what I wish to do." And then what follows is a fascinating dialogue in which she and her guide work out the details of the deafness. So there you have a story of pre-birth planning in which the intention in planning the challenge is healing.
So in Penelope's case, the deafness was almost like training wheels or those bumper rails on at the bowling alley, so that she doesn't go over the edge and experience something that was so traumatic that it literally, made an imprint on her and crossed into a next life.
That's exactly right. It's a very good way to put it. And there's another component here to her pre-birth planning, which I haven't mentioned yet, and that is the pre-birth choice to be completely deaf, female, and she's also African American. She chose those three, we can call them identifiers, for a particular reason. What she wanted, in addition to healing, was to deepen in compassion in this lifetime. I talk a lot about something I call divine virtues. These are qualities that are important to the soul. Compassion is one of the divine virtues. So she felt before she was born that this relatively rare combination of being completely deaf, female, and African American would put her in a lot of situations that would provide both the opportunity and the motivation to cultivate compassion. And that's actually exactly how it's worked out. She's cultivated tremendous compassion through her experiences, and now she uses that compassion in her work. She's a teacher in the deaf community.
So it's almost as though her illness has sort of led her to her purpose in a lot of ways.
Very much so. Yeah.
Yeah, I can relate to that. So when I was in my early 20s, I was poisoned and I became really sick, and I'm still dealing with that. It's been like 10 years of pain and suffering. And when I look back on everything and I analyze it, it all makes sense. It walked me into this and walked me into that and helped me understand things. And I certainly wouldn't be doing this podcast if that hadn't happened. I'd be, getting rich in cybersecurity or whatever I was working on at the time. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense, and especially when you start looking at it from the pre-birth planning standpoint, it can really help people get through stuff. Because I know there's a lot of people out there suffering, and they're going through like what you might call a dark night of the soul. And that's a massive catalyst for what we could call spiritual awakening. And listening to stuff like this and reading books like yours can really help people get through that. Um, do you know anything about the dark night of the soul? Is that something that you've looked into? You want to speak on that?
Yeah, the dark night of the soul is a very common phenomenon, and it's planned as part of the pre-birth plans as a potential. So maybe you are going to need a dark night of the soul to, let's say, break open your heart so that you'll do what you came to do and learn what you came to learn. Or maybe you won't need that. Maybe you'll use your free will and do it an easier way. But that dark night of the soul is often planned as a potential. There's an example of that in Your Soul's Plan, the story about the pre-birth planning of alcoholism. So it's about a gentleman named Pat who was an alcoholic for decades. And one day the suffering becomes so intense. He's home alone in his kitchen. He's been drinking too much. He literally falls to his knees and calls out to God for help. And from that moment forward, his life turned around. Shortly thereafter, he checked into rehab, and his life has been far better ever since. So his dark night of the soul put him on a healing path. That's very often what it takes, because humans tend to be sort of stubborn in their learning, resistant to the learning. And there's no shame in doing it that way. It's essentially a way of breaking the heart open so that you will ask for the help you need and be willing to receive it too.
It's sort of like, we get wrapped up in life with all the things that we want and don't want, and our identity that we've taken on. And then that becomes so loud, we can't hear the spirit. We can't hear our soul speaking to us through our intuition and our dreams and stuff. And we need almost this catalyst moment to break us out of this thing, so that we can actually start doing what we came here to do, which likely involves some kind of spiritual growth and service to others.
That's exactly right. And it's interesting you choose the word catalyst, because in some of the channeled literature, life challenges are referred to as catalysts.
Yeah, I like that word over others. It just appeals to me. I think I got it from the Law of One material. But it's a catalyst moment. It's something that invokes a binary decision. For example, with your quitting your job and going into your spiritual work, if you weren't so unsatisfied to the point where you just said, enough is enough, I'm going to quit, then maybe you never would have gotten into this and you wouldn't be doing it.
Well, there's another aspect to that. You talked about how the fact that you were poisoned put you on the path you're on now, and you wouldn't be doing this podcast if not for that. My story is similar in a way. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but I grew up in a very dysfunctional, abusive family situation. My mother has significant mental health issues and was quite abusive to me. And that naturally produced a longing in me to understand, how does something like this happen? Why would this happen? If God is truly loving, how can a loving God allow this kind of thing to happen? So those questions were burning deep inside of me. And I would not be doing what I'm doing today if I hadn't had that experience.
A lot of people have a similar story of suffering or trauma before they get into this type of stuff. And honestly, I think that's what it takes, really, to get you to the point where you actually take it seriously. You have to sort of be broken down so you can rebuild yourself back up.
And you have to have the motivation to do that rebuilding. I mean, if things are going fairly well, you won't have the motivation to do it, and you'll just go along with a normal mainstream lifestyle. There's no incentive to do anything any different.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's probably where I'd be if I didn't have my issue. And I'm at the point now where I don't want to say this in a egoic way, but sometimes I see people that haven't suffered and I think, oh man, I'm glad that I'm not them, because, yes, they have this blissful ignorance, but they also don't get to take part in, maybe what they came here to do. They're a little distracted or something.
Well, what I've seen in my research, if somebody isn't waking up in order to do what they came here to do, the soul, in conjunction with the person's guides, will bring about events that are intended to facilitate that awakening. And there's often a pattern here where the same kind of challenge will come around again and again and again in that person's life. And each time it comes back in increasingly intense form. I'm thinking now of a woman who I worked with as a private client many years ago. And she was in her 40s at the time she was talking with me. But she told me this interesting story. When she had been in her 20s, she and her daughter, who was 7 at that time, went to a swimming pool during the summer. She was lying in the sun in a lounge chair. The little girl was playing in the water. Well, all of a sudden, the little girl jumped up out of the swimming pool, ran over to this woman, and said to her, "You're not waking up the way we planned before we were born, so you're going to have a really bad accident." Well, of course, the mother was horrified. What was my daughter saying? But sure enough, shortly thereafter, she had a car accident, which did not trigger the spiritual awakening. A year later, she had a second and worse car accident, which did not trigger a spiritual awakening. A year later, she had a third and even worse car accident, which did trigger a spiritual awakening. I can't tell you the number of times I've seen that pattern in somebody's life.
I've heard of this before, yeah. And when I look at my life, because that's you know my reference point, I can see one major issue before I had my poisoning incident, and thank God I took heed of the second one, right? Because the third one could be something insane.
Yeah, and this is not something to go into fear over. And it's not something to look at as a harsh or a negative thing. I know it can certainly feel that way when you have that experience, but the ultimate intention of the universe is not to be harsh or unloving. It's to help you awaken at your own request, made pre-birth.
Right, right. Again, we don't want to slip back into the victim mentality,
Right.
taking ownership and responsibility for all of it. Understanding that, our higher self, our higher mind, the totality of our existence actually chose this from a place of higher wisdom. And if we were reintegrated into that, we would probably do the same thing.
That's exactly right.
Um, I also think that there's a point in one's development where the suffering no longer becomes useful as a tool. And I think a lot of that has to do when you reach a point of surrender and non-resistance. Because if let's say that you have a very enlightened person, something that quote unquote bad could happen to them, and they probably will instantaneously view it as a benefit or some opportunity for growth. And they're kind of at the point where maybe they don't really need suffering anymore. And then that kind of
Well,
gets
there are people in the world who actually don't experience suffering. They tend not to be famous, and the media tends not to report on this kind of thing, but they're out there. The great mystic Krishnamurti used to say, "I don't mind anything." What he meant was that nothing bothers him, which means he never went into resistance to anything. I spoke to a woman some years ago who was in combat in the Iraq War. She was blown up in a bomb explosion, hospitalized in tremendous, tremendous physical pain, but she never experienced a single moment of suffering. She was never in any resistance to the pain she was in. She's just an ordinary person. There's no reason the media are going to seek her out and report on this story. But I mention it because this is where each one of us is headed eventually. And it's important just to know that that kind of life is possible, even if you aren't yet there yourself.
it takes a lot of self-awareness and what you might call self-mastery to get to that point. At least I've found. I mean, it's difficult to not when you're in it, you're in a situation and you just can't stand it. It's difficult to pull yourself out of that. Um, do you have any techniques for becoming aware of this stuff, or is it just repetition over time, reading this type of material?
Well, the repetition certainly helps, but this, I think, is where prayer and meditation come in. If your intention is to get yourself to a place of total non-resistance to life, pray and ask for assistance in doing that. Prayer is very, very powerful. And meditation is really the means of getting there. There are many, many different kinds of meditation, which are intended to help get you to a place of pure awareness so that you don't go into resistance to objects of consciousness, thoughts, feelings, bodily sensations. I don't think it necessarily matters which of these methods of meditation you use, but I think you've got to use one of them. I don't know that you can get to pure awareness without that.
I don't think so. Probably not. Yeah, and I would agree that meditation is one of the most, if not the most important, uh, tangible practices that people can engage in. And the more that you do it for people that aren't experienced with it, in my experience, it starts to put sort of a gap between the stimuli in your external environment and then your inner state. So let's say that something happens maybe that triggers you in the past. Somebody says something or someone does something in traffic, where versus being an immediate response, there's a gap in between. Maybe it's 2 seconds, 5 seconds, and then you can decide, oh, am I going to lean into this negative emotion or am I just going to let it go?
I think that that's very well put. And this is something that the beings of light have talked with my wife and I about. And the way they put it, they said thoughts and feelings have a strong gravity and they tend to suck you in. So it's like you're standing in front of a tree and a strong emotion, for example, comes along. And then all of a sudden you're up in the tree branches. You can't even really tell you're at a tree anymore. You're just up in the branches. And so by meditating, you don't get pulled into the tree branches. You're always standing in front of the tree as the neutral observer of the tree.
Yeah, I really like that. Also, you can see the whole tree because you're out of it versus being
Exactly.
tangled up in the branches.
Right.
How does one find their purpose that they set out to accomplish or to live out in this lifetime?
Well, again, prayer, ask to be shown your purpose, ask for clarity, direction. Meditation, when your mind is relatively quiet, inspiration, ideas can come in a lot more easily. Your interest, people overlook that. They don't understand how profound interest is. Your guidance from spirit shows up in the form of interest. We could ask the question, where does interest come from? And there are many possible answers, but I would say that is your guidance. When I first started doing the research for my first book, I was doing a channeling session with Jesus. And I said, there's so many people in the world who have compelling, important stories to tell. How do I choose who to put in my book? And he said, follow your interest. It really is that simple.
That's a great point. I think so. There was a quote, I don't know who said it. It's an old one, and it says that man can do whatever he wills, but he cannot will what he wills. And that was kind of I think they're talking about predestination a little bit in that. But what it reminds me of that because I think that I mentioned earlier the higher self and the totality of our existence, which is much larger than this fractioned off, siphoned off incarnation that we have here. I think that thing, that part of us has intentions. It has things that it wants to do and experience through us. And if if we're really psychic, maybe we can actually hear those. Maybe we can see them if we can talk to guides or angels or something. But for the average person that can't do that, I think that uh, those drives sort of get funneled into what you could call our subconscious, and then emanate out through us, through our desires, through our wants and things that we feel drawn to, talents. How do you feel about that?
I completely agree with you. There is, I'd like to mention a very specific way you can find out about your purpose, and that's the form of hypnosis I practice called the between life soul regression. So, in the shorthand is a BLSR. What you do in a BLSR, it's a long process, but ultimately you end up in front of what is called your council of elders. And those are the very wise, loving, highly evolved beings who oversee your personal evolution. Everybody has their own council. Once you get to your council, you can ask literally any question about your life. And if it's for the highest good, they'll answer. So one of the most common questions is, what is the purpose of this incarnation? Or what is my purpose? People also ask, what did I plan? Why did I make those plans? How am I doing? How can I do better in terms of fulfilling my plans? But they'll go through every significant relationship and say, what is my plan with this person? Every major challenge. Why did this happen? Did I really plan it? Why did I do that? And people come out of a conversation with their council of elders filled with the deeper meaning and purpose of their life.
Yeah, that I've done stuff similar to that. Not the between life thing, but I've had astrological sessions and other things, and it was a little bit more organic than just getting an answer from a guide. But I've used things like that in automatic writing and dream analysis and just looking at the patterns in your life. Hey, like what is God or my higher self trying to show me here through all of these patterns in my life when you pan out to the strategic viewpoint. But yeah, if you can go straight to the source with something like the type of hypnosis that you offer, that's probably a much easier way of figuring that out versus stumbling in the dark. It is so what you do, a lot of people are probably familiar with the Dolores Cannon and her methodology. Is it similar to that?
I certainly know who Dolores Cannon is, but I've never really taken a close look at what her hypnosis technique is all about. So I can't really answer that question. One thing I will say, though, is that you can do a between life soul regression either as a private session or in one of our online workshops as a group, and it works just as well either way.
Okay, good to know. Yeah, I mean, so Dolores, she just teaches the QHHT. I have no idea how they actually do it. But it's putting people in this somnambulistic state where it's like a theta state or something like that. So I've been doing self-hypnosis for a long time, just not on clients or anything, but just for myself. And then that sort of led into astral projection and out of body experiences. And then that has sort of been kind of like my gateway to getting answers for certain things. It's kind of like using psychedelics without actually having to use psychedelics in a way.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But I mean, heck, I'd be interested in doing one of your sessions. I mean, who knows? I'm sure that there'd be something there that I wouldn't know now. Do we all have guides or guardian angels or something, or is it just some people?
As far as I know, everybody has spirit guides, guardian angels, higher self, certainly, ascended masters who work with you.
Got it. And some of these groups are communicating with people who are more perceptive, channelers, things like that, to try to help with this ascension process of humanity, right?
I think that's correct. And it's my understanding there are more channels in the world now than ever before. And it seems like new people are opening to channeling all the time. So I think there's this big push on the other side of the veil to help people awaken so that we can go through the ascension process successfully.
I think the veil, which can, you know, be described in many different ways, is sort of thinning in a lot of ways. That's what it seems like to me. And paranormal and mystical experiences are becoming more commonplace for the common person. There are people that I know who are not even into any of this stuff who are becoming a lot more open-minded. And I think that that has to do with kind of the rising tide that's lifting all of humanity. Is
I,
that
I
kind of
think I think that's exactly what is happening. And yet, as we see in the news, there are people who, for one reason or another, prefer the old energy and the old ways of doing things. And those people are lashing out. But that's all part of the purification process.
right? Well, certain institutions that have been sort of a detriment to humanity, I think, are falling away. And as those institutions fall apart, the people that run them, as they lose power, are going to lash out. And I wouldn't be surprised if they tried to flip the whole table just to save themselves at some point.
It's very possible. Yeah.
But I don't think that those people win ultimately. And I think that it seems like and this is kind of like what you were saying before, is during this ascension process, there's sort of these things that are being brought to the surface, and we have to integrate them collectively and individually. What happens to those who refuse to evolve?
You get, as I understand it, you're given many, many opportunities. But at a certain point, if you continue to refuse, Your energy is, we could say, recycled. And I'm not sure that I understand fully what that entails or what it means, but that's the word that I've seen in the channeled literature. Well, one thing I want to comment on, you talked about flipping the tables possibly. Um, my wife and I have asked the beings of light about this, and they had a very reassuring response. They said ascension is coming from the level of cause. And nothing on the level of effect, which would be the third density world, can alter what is coming from the level of cause.
That's a really good way to put it. And are you familiar with like the Kabbalah tree of life?
I've seen it. I don't know a lot about it.
Okay. Yeah, it can get quite complex. But as you get down to the very bottom, you have this sort of three-dimensional reality that we live in here. We have the physical universe. And that is an effect of this much higher cause, all the way back to source God itself. So yeah, you're absolutely right. If a higher force, a higher cause on a higher level of causation intends to have a certain effect, how can it be possible that the effect can then interact with that cause because it's at the effect? So it makes perfect sense.
Exactly. Yeah.
Great. So you're optimistic for the
I
next few
am.
years.
I am.
Okay, good, good. Yeah, there's a lot of people pushing, fear narratives out there, but I don't see those narratives really winning. I see people becoming more loving and more intelligent and more aware of what's going on, more discerning. Um, and it all seems to be, although there's a lot of turmoil, it seems that we're moving in a positive trajectory. Now, if you watch the news all day, obviously it doesn't look like that, but you know, don't do that.
It's good advice.
um, right, right. So, coming up on an hour here. We mentioned some of your books, Your Soul's Plan. I endorse that. I'm halfway through it now. Any other places that you want to send the audience?
Well, the second book is Your Soul's Gift. The new book is Your Soul's Love. That's specifically about the pre-birth planning of challenges in romantic relationships. The website is yoursoulsplan.com. I would invite everybody, sign up for the newsletter and the pop-up as soon as you get there. Check out the events page. That's where all the workshops are listed. Take a look at the sessions page for more information about a private between life soul regression. On that page, there's actually a 1 hour video of a specific between life soul regression. So you can see exactly what's involved in that. And then there's a lot of great channeled material that my wife has created, a membership community called Rise to the Path, which is really a beautiful community of very loving people who just support each other on a spiritual path. We meet online once a month. So there's a lot going on that I would invite people to look into.
All right. Well, thank you for coming on the show.
You're welcome. And I want to thank you for having this show. I think what you're doing is bringing a lot of much needed light into our world.